Alright folks, this is a brief flipped lecture for our Assessment 10.1 work. So I'm in the specific Google Classroom for Assessment 10.1. If I wanted to, I could open up the checklist down here at the bottom. Some of you are working off a paper copy, some of you are working off this digital copy, but we can see here that topic 1, there are 2 pieces of required work. Right? And we're looking at this one right now, myths about civil rights. See, there's a flipped lecture, a notes sheet, and a fact check. And that's what I want to make sure you don't forget, is after you've taken down the notes and listened to this lecture, I need you to go in and answer these Google form questions as well. Alright, so I want to give you just a few key ideas or misunderstandings that people have about the civil rights movement. This isn't all the pieces of the information, but just a few key ideas. So before we get started, obviously, I think it's important that we define or redefine the words civil rights. And we're going to define it here as the rights of a person to be socially and politically free to express and protect themselves. So when we talk about someone being socially involved, we talk about the way in which people act, interact, and treat one another. So socially, there's a lot that happens in high school that's unrelated directly to academics like math, history, phy ed, etc. There's a lot socially going on. And then the word politically is the way in which people in their government interact. So we're talking about the rights of a person to be socially and politically free to express and protect themselves. So we have this very silly but also very sad picture of segregated drinking fountains getting the exact same water, one fancy for whites only and then one for people of color. And so the person here's civil rights are being limited. He cannot drink from certain drinking fountains, and if he wanted to do something to change that in this era, he would likely be punished and be unable to protect himself. So that's civil rights. The first myth that we want to lock down is that traditionally marginalized groups were pretty much okay with being marginalized until World War I. I know that sounds silly, but we want to make this very clear, right? Despite having limited educational opportunities and few legal rights, traditionally marginalized groups, whether we're talking about women, whether we're talking about Asian Americans, whether we're talking about African Americans, any group that has been traditionally not given civil rights, they've always pushed for more rights. So a good example is way back in 1831, decades before the Civil War, a person who was held as a slave named Nat Turner led a significant slave rebellion, killing over 50 people. They even made a movie about it in 2016 called Birth of a Nation, which is kind of a secret dig because in the 19-teens, about 100 years ago, the most popular movie in the country was not a Marvel movie, but a movie about the Ku Klux Klan, making the Ku Klux Klan seem cool. And that movie was called The Birth of a Nation. So this movie about a black man standing up took the same name to prove a point. The second myth is that thing that's not true, is that traditionally marginalized groups that have the most success in gaining civil rights always seem to have the best leaders. And that's false. Often overlooked is the pressure by regular people to make real change happen. Right, so here we have an image of Bloody Sunday, and if you remember from the movie in Selma, there were lots of just regular people taking part in this march. Another way to look at it would be the fact that Dr. King wasn't even present at Bloody Sunday in Selma, and yet that was an event that really triggered a huge groundswell of support. Another example could be the LGBTQ movement. There's not one clear, direct leader. There are certainly famous people that are part of that community, but that group hasn't necessarily had a Martin Luther King type leader, and yet they saw a huge change in the last 15 years in their access to civil rights. The third myth is pretty specific, but it's one that I want to make sure that I touch base on, since I'm not going to be spending much time in front of the class. in this unit. The Black Panther Party and Malcolm X were committed to a violent overthrow of the United States government. That is false. Now, we have to be honest, and it is true that both the Black Panther Party, which some of you have never heard of, but here's a picture of two of their founders, the Black Panther Party and Malcolm X, who we met in Selma, they often spoke of, and the Black Panther Party absolutely did use violence in the way that they felt that they were defending their rights. But it's overly simplified to say that they were just solving all their problems with violence. Malcolm X made it very clear in his speeches that it was important that black people learn about their history, as well as being willing to stand up for themselves. And the other example is this group called the Black Panther Party, who's often depicted like this, carrying guns, because they absolutely did that. But they also served, essentially, what we would call second chance breakfast to children in big cities, and they pushed for better housing for African Americans. So this isn't saying that they didn't use violence, or that both these groups didn't talk a lot about using violence, but that isn't the only thing they talked about. That's the part that we want to make clear. So this is just kind of an introduction, a challenge that we really look deeply into these civil rights issues, because it's not a very simple issue for any of these groups or for any of these people. Now what I'd like you to do is review the notes and then take the Google form quiz that asks just a few basic questions about this. Thanks.